Welcome everybody to today's lunchtime webinar. All week long we're doing webinars because it is Churches Count on Nature this week as part of the Beautiful Burial Ground project. So there are over 240 churches all around the country that are going out doing biological recording this week. And then nationally we're running our series of 10 webinars on different aspects of land and nature. And this lunchtime session is going to be a really, really interesting one. It's getting an insight into the church commissioners. The church commissioners have a really significant rural portfolio, and they're seeking to lead the way in how they manage their land to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. And you'll hear today an overview of the commissioners' farm holdings, recent work that they've been doing on carbon and natural capital baselining, and some of the collaborative links that they're establishing with other environmental groups, engaging with farm tenants, and some really positive initiatives that are ongoing at the moment. I always start by telling you what else there is coming up. So we're on the highlighted webinar there. We've got 5 more this week. So this afternoon, Blooming and Beautiful about flower-rich churchyards. Tomorrow we've got a session with Natural England about the Nature Recovery Network, which Tony Juniper is going to be speaking at, and then a session tomorrow afternoon on how church spaces can be used for growing food and growing mission. And then on Friday, the session on urban hope I think will be a really useful one for those of you who have more urban parishes, because it's looking at how we use small spaces for nature. And then we're finishing the week with a really big picture look at the globe, from global to local, the joint crises for biodiversity loss and climate change. Once the special land and nature series is over, we'll be turning back more to the webinars that we do on net zero carbon. So there's one in June on the upcoming faculty changes, and then there's one in September on central procurement by parish buying in 2x2, or for how that can help parishes through things like energy audits and solar panels. So our speakers today. Today we are being joined by, get that right instead. I'm on the housekeeping slide. I was looking down here rather than up there. In terms of the housekeeping today, as usual, we'll use the Q&A rather than the chat. So please do find the Q&A, pop your questions in there, and you can also do thumbs up next to other people's questions, and those will come to the top. After today, I'll send you Ciara and Guy's slides and also any links that are shared in the chat, and the recording will be shared on our website. Because there's quite a few webinars this week, it might take me a few days, but they will be on our website for you to watch back. Right, most importantly, the introductions. We're being joined today by Ciara Williams and Guy Webb. They are asset managers, senior asset managers in the Church Commissioners Rural team. That means that they are the asset managers responsible for the oversight of the rural portfolio and delivery of strategy. They are both chartered surveyors and have previously worked as land agents. So they have a really in-depth understanding of the challenges that are currently being faced by farmers and landowners during the current agricultural transition. So I will now stop sharing my slides and hand over to Ciara to share their slides and to take us away.
Brilliant. So I'm hoping this is going to work, and Catherine, perhaps you can let me know on behalf of everybody if you are able to see.
Yeah.
All good. Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much, Catherine, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody joining us. Welcome to the Churches Count on Nature webinar series on behalf of myself, Ciara Williams, and obviously my colleague Guy. So we just hope to spend the next 30 minutes or so discussing how the Church Commissioners are managing land for climate and nature, but hopefully leaving plenty of time for some of the questions in the chat at the end. And as Catherine said, the slides will be made available after the webinar. So firstly, I thought it would be helpful to provide a little bit of context and background on who the Church Commissioners are and their main purpose, some of which you may already know, but I think it's probably helpful for those who are unfamiliar. So the Church Commissioners are a registered charity and responsible for administering the property assets for the Church of England. Our main role and purpose is to fund the wider mission and ministry of the Church, and this is largely through the investment management of £10.1 billion of assets which are contained within the Commissioners Fund. So about 25% of these assets are property, property based, so real assets, which include residential property, commercial property, farmland that we'll focus on today, but as well as commercial forestry and land that might be used for future strategic development. The commissioners were formed in 1948 when Queen Anne's Bounty was merged with the ecclesiastical commissioners to form what is now the Church Commissioners for England, with 33 commissioners, and the most notable, of course, being the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, but also other officers of state and government ministers as well. So hopefully, as you can see from the slide, I've popped a part there on our fiduciary duty, and achieving best value is very critical to all of our decision making. This really governs all the choices, and we're currently looking at the relationship very much between best value and our environmental obligations and opportunities. And we recognise, of course, that in some circumstances best value extends beyond financial considerations, as some of you might have picked up in a recent court case. We're also responsible for largely delivering on the triennium funding to the Church of England, and as such, we managed our assets in a way that allows us to commit more than £1.2 billion to the work of the Church for the period of 2023 to 2025. So we have a target of delivering a total return across the whole investment fund of CPIH plus 4%, but we're also committed to delivering the returns in the most responsible way possible. So when we come on to look at our role in managing the natural environment, we can see that as biodiversity and carbon markets develop, we expect that the understanding of value of both financial value as well as other capital values, so natural capital, for example, will move very much closer to aligning. The commissioners have 6 overall strategic priority aims, which include the need to act within our ethical guidelines and be at the forefront of responsible investment globally. And I think it's worth me saying that if you'd like to find out more about the commissioners and how the funds are allocated and managed, I'd recommend heading over to our annual report that was published recently. So just turning our attention to the commissioners' rural assets. So the total fund is made up of 5.8% of agricultural land, which we manage and will refer to today as the rural portfolio. So Guy and myself oversee the strategic decisions of the portfolio, and we have 2 additional colleagues, but we also use the assistance of retained land agents spread across the country. The rural holdings are spread, as I've just referred to, across England, with coverage from Devon in the southwest. We then go across to Kent, Essex in the southeast, and then holdings really spread throughout the country to Carlisle in the northwest and Tyneside in the northeast. So as you'll have seen again from my slide, all of the land within the rural portfolio is let to farming tenants. And I think this is fairly fundamental, as it means that all of the land is out with our direct management control and is being farmed by, a mix of multi-generational family businesses, one-man band farmers, global commercial agricultural businesses, and then everything in between. So an entirely let portfolio. In some cases, the farms also include farmhouses, as you'd expect, but also residential cottages and commercial farm buildings, with diversification being quite common amongst our tenant pool, who are obviously looking to maximise the opportunities across the farm. So, for example, looking at traditional farm shops or children's nurseries, and we even have extreme running events across the portfolio. We have renewables as well, both at a larger scale with a small number of solar farms, but also more commonly on-farm renewables. So, for example, solar panels on barn sheds, wind turbines and battery storage facilities. And the commissioners' estates and farm holdings are largely a mix of historical ownership, with much of the land being transferred to the ecclesiastical commissioners around the mid-1800s from the bishopric estates, which were essentially an area that was governed by a bishop, and others which we've purchased more recently, perhaps in the last century. So as such, the commissioners' rural land is not static and is covered by all farming practices and types. So that said, we also do have a very strong presence of arable farming with other areas and pockets of dairy, as well as mixed farm holdings, but with fewer purely livestock farms. There's also a number of horticultural businesses which focus on growing specialist crops. So, for example, salad crops, horseradish, spring onions, soft fruit and berries. And over 90% of the land that's let to our farming tenants would be considered very productive farmland. So as I said, over 90% being categorised as grade 1, 2 or 3 soils under the recognised agricultural land classification series. And this is really essential for obviously considering the role of food production, but also our place within the food security discussions that are very real at the moment, especially with the current geopolitical climate. So I'm just going to hand over now to Guy.
Thank you, Ciara. As you can see, the Church Commissioners for England's portfolio is varied. Clearly, this creates numerous environmental opportunities as well as some challenges. To start with, we recognise the importance of creating realistic and achievable targets. Therefore, we have set the target of 2050 to have a net zero fund, including the rural portfolio. This is in conjunction with being a member of Net Zero Assets Owners Alliance, which is a UN-concerned alliance for investment bodies who are committed to transitioning their investment portfolio to a net zero by 2050. We have not set any formal biodiversity targets within the rural portfolio, although we have clearly set out the direction of travel, with the Church Commissioners being a founding member of the Nature Action 100. This is an investor-led collaborative engagement programme to engage with companies and policymakers on nature and is launching later this summer. Clearly, we have signed up some internationally recognised targets and goals for the fund. I will now bring it back down to a rural level and set out the real changes we have conducted recently. Paul Jaffe has joined the real assets team to lead and oversee the integration of ESG strategy across the real assets portfolio. We in the rural team have been working closely with Paul to bring him up to speed on all the work we've been carrying out to date, as well as what we have got planned. Alongside Paul and our environmental advisors, Cumulus Consultants, we are co-creating a sustainability strategy and vision, which will set out how we will achieve our net zero targets and improve the biodiversity of the rural portfolio. This strategy will provide a concise roadmap to achieving our net zero target and how our biodiversity will improve. It will be a state-specific whilst also providing a vision from a portfolio perspective, and will focus on material improvements which can be achieved. One of the most important pieces of work we have done to date is conducting a natural capital and carbon audit, which I will detail on the next slide. In the autumn of 2020, we partnered with Cumulus Consultants alongside Freekill and ACOM to create a baseline for our natural capital position and carbon output within the rural portfolio. We collated a variety of data from different sources. Some was publicly available, such as environmental designations, whilst other data sets, such as land cover and woody features, were obtained through the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And we also utilised our own data and best assumptions from our agents. This provided baseline for carbon outputs from the rural portfolio and our natural capital position. I would briefly touch on what is meant by carbon output within the rural portfolio, which is helpfully summarised by the diagram within this slide. Firstly, it focused on the effect agricultural activities have on greenhouse gas emissions. This can be both positive and negative. For example, cultivating soils will release carbon from the soil, whereas planting more hedgerows and having wider field margins will have a beneficial impact on soil emissions. The other major impactor on the carbon output from the rural portfolio is greenhouse gas emissions from farming operations, including fuel use, livestock, methane emissions, and fertiliser applications. Furthermore, as Ciara mentioned, the rural portfolio includes some residential buildings which emit greenhouse gases through electric and fuel use. These carbon outputs are measured under 3 scopes, with Scope 1 emissions being those owned by the Commissioners, Scopes 2 associated with electricity use and fuel, and Scope 3, the activity of land, the activity on the land and emissions associated with the use of the land. The developing strategy will assess how further data can be collated and improvements secured. I will now run through our stewardship reporting. Ethical and responsible investments are at the heart of our investment strategy and applied across all assets. The stewardship report is published annually, with the 2021 review due to be published shortly, and sets out how our responsible investment targets will be achieved. The 2021 report focused on 5 key elements, including how we ensured good stewardship, such as ethical exclusion, ESG integration, and impact investing, and it reviewed our achievements for the year, our governance, and an idea of what is to come for the following year. We will be publishing our stewardship report reviewing 2021 next week, which will focus on the two key themes being respect for the planet and people, with some important rural focuses. I will now briefly outline where the Stewardship report focused on the rural portfolio. It will focus on our incorporation of farm sustainability within farm lettings, our baseline work, commissioners' visits, and preventing modern slavery. We would be happy to share the link to the Stewardship report when it is published.
Brilliant, thank you guys. So looking at some of the recent initiatives that we've introduced, some of you joining us today will hopefully have picked up in the media that previously the commitment from the commissioners, as well as a group of other significant landowners and industry leaders to sign up to some ambitious guiding principles. So the others that I mentioned include the Soil Association, Duchy of Cornwall, Holcombe Estate, National Trust, the RSPB, Nature Friendly Farming Network, the Wildlife Trust, Yorkshire Water and Landscapes for Life. So the focus of the agreement, which was actually labelled a compact, is to commit to using climate and nature-based solutions. So you may ask, what exactly are nature-based solutions? Well, they are land management interventions that use nature and ecosystems to deliver improvements for public and biodiversity. So some examples to give you an idea include woodland creation, coastal realignment, planting of riparian buffers and flood prevention, building with nature in urban areas, and wetland restoration. And all of these commitments made by all the parties signed up to the compact must be seen very much alongside the supply of food, so crops and livestock, as well as ensuring high welfare standards and timber supply. Within the compact, there are 6 principles which are set out in detail, such as looking to implement changes alongside, but not instead of meaningful action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. All of the organisations who signed up have pledged to recommend the standards to their members, and the compact recognises the need for partnerships between landowners and tenants to really affect real-world change. Part of the compact is seeking to encourage the government to support this through the design of the ELM scheme and local nature recovery strategies. And the commissioners are very much dedicated to the principles of the compact. And if you have time to take a look at the detail, you'll note that the compact includes a case study from the commissioners of woodland creation in Perthshire. So another recent initiative, in March 2022, the commissioners were approached by the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust to become one of their Blue Recovery leaders. So this is an initiative that was launched by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, and again brings together a group of influential businesses who are seeking to assist the WWT in its target to create 100,000 hectares of wetland, including blue infrastructure. This Blue Recovery Group doesn't include just landowners, but also notable names that you may recognise. So, for example, National Grid, Severn Trent Water, Triodos Bank, Jacobs, and the People's Postcode Lottery. This initiative is incredibly important as well for us if you consider that wetlands are the most effective carbon sinks on the planet, with peatland storage being able to store twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. So in just a few short months since we've signed the statement of intent for the Blue Recovery leaders, we've had a number of projects underway, which include the creation of a wetland habitat just outside of Exeter, where we've been working collaboratively with the Environment Agency and the local authority there. We're also working with our farming tenants to increase the number of wetland habitats on the commissioners' farms. So this might include field scrapes, ponds and streams. We're reviewing salt marsh habitat with a view to obviously looking at improvement and further creation, and also looking to incorporate wetland systems into housing development that our strategic development colleagues lead on. So just moving on to the next slide, I'm sure you'll agree that the Queen's Green Canopy Initiative very relevant, having hopefully everybody celebrated the Platinum Jubilee last weekend. And this unique initiative has really provided the opportunity for us to recognise some of our long-standing tenant relationships across the portfolio. So hopefully you'll see on the slide in front of you the photograph. We have our first Church Estates Commissioner, Alan Smith, who joined us earlier in the year to present an English oak tree to some of our farm tenants who've occupied the land for over 100 years. And we were really keen to use this opportunity to mark this incredible multi-generational relationship that we have, but also to obviously plant new trees across the farms, which will certainly remain for the next century as well. The initiative has also been taken up across the portfolio, with trees being planted in London across the Commissioners Hyde Park estate, and we have other planting projects in the pipeline for the upcoming planting season, which will look at a very much a larger scale. So we've got 12,000 trees being planted in mixed broadleaf near Carlisle, and we have other significant and very sizable blocks being assessed for the tree planting opportunities there as well. As part of that exercise, we're undertaking further woodland reviews, including considering opportunities for riparian planting, and also have formed a very close working relationship with both the Forestry Commission and Forestry England to seek to understand how their grant schemes can work, not only for us, but our farm tenants as well. And the work that we've done through the Queen's Green Canopy and other planting projects and others that have planned allows us not only to obviously work with the farm tenants, but also for other community groups and local schools who are keen to get involved. And one such project that's going to take place towards the latter end of 2022 includes working with a multi-faith group who are seeking to bring urban and inner city community groups onto commissioners' farms to help with hedgerow planting projects. So this work's also being supported by the Woodland Trust, with in-hedge trees forming part of the project, which will see a number of kilometres of new hedgerow planted. And we're really hopeful that this will be a huge success and that the volunteer project will be able to be scaled up for the future years across other farms.
Thanks,
Guy,
Ciara.
over to you.
Thank you. So Ciara and I have been having numerous conversations with industry bodies, as well as supermarkets, academic bodies and advisory groups. There are lots of conversations taking place, and we are very much taking the approach of saying yes to everything in order to understand all the innovative ideas emerging and how others are working together. For example, the launch of the School of Sustainable Food and Farming being a partnership between NFU, McDonald's, Morrison's and Harper Adams. We have formed a good working group alongside the Duchy of Lancaster, Duchy of Cornwall and the Crown Estate. This has allowed us to share best practices and discuss challenges with similar institutional landowners. We have also engaged with National Trust and are instigating regular meetings with them to ensure we understand our shared concerns and challenges. We have regular meetings with the Tenant Farmers Association to understand how, through a collaborative approach, we will be able to succeed in achieving our net zero target. These meetings have led to Ciara and I having non-agenda meetings with tenants and developing stronger relationships. We also recognise that to achieve our net zero target, we need to complete cross-sector collaboration, as supermarkets and buying groups have increased ability to influence change. Therefore, we have had multiple meetings with Arla, Morrison's and others. This has allowed us to understand how as a sector we will achieve net zero targets and improve the biodiversity. It has also led us to in the formation of the Future Land Forum, which I'll now discuss. The Future Land Forum was set up to try and answer the question, how will the future of land management ensure that landlord and tenant collaboration can enable a positive response to the climate and biodiversity crisis? It brought together an array of people from different industries associated with agriculture, including landowners, bankers, suppliers, farmers and supermarkets. We had our first meeting last month with Baroness Rock from Tenancy Working Group joining us. The discussions was wide and varied, with the conclusion being that collaboration between landlord and tenant will be absolutely key. We will continue to work together with the working group and unpick how through new tenancy arrangements there can be improvements to biodiversity and carbon output. The way we advertise for tenants has recently changed, and assessing the sustainability of future tenants is vital during the selection process. We are now seeking tenants who have a good understanding of our net zero and environmental aspirations, and this is demonstrated in our farm letting particulars. Through our agents, we then conduct a thorough interview process to ensure that new tenants' aims and objectives are aligned with our own. We also conduct thorough referencing, and this ensures the new tenants have sustainable agricultural businesses. This has been hugely successful during marketing exercises to find new and progressive arable farm tenants, such as those in the southeast in Essex and Kent. A similar exercise was carried out to find a new 10-year farm business tenant at Carlisle, with the successful candidate introducing a sustainable beef system to the holding. All the tenants selected have strong sustainability credentials, with a focus on soil health, biodiversity improvements, and have a willingness to share data and collaborate with us as landlords. Ciara will now discuss our further tenant engagement which has been conducted and how we have created a tenant profile.
Great. So as I mentioned earlier in our presentation, our rural land holdings are all let to farming tenants, and as such, the commissioners do not have the day-to-day control of the farming decisions and the practices that are taken on the actual ground. So Guy's just outlined how we're looking to influence and work with our pool of new tenants during lettings, but clearly we also need to collaborate with those whom occupy the holdings already, with many having done so for 2 generations before them. This has meant that we've taken the opportunity to try and increase our direct involvement with our tenants, as well as through our appointed managing land agents. So Guy said about the non-agenda and informal meetings, which have really been fundamental in building up and helping to establish a more trusted relationship and allow us to understand more about the aspirations of our farmers, particularly in relation to the environment. So we found that despite the commissioners having hundreds of farming tenants across England, many are already very engaged and undertaking exciting and innovative projects, as well as wanting to work with us. So some examples that we've found are agroforestry planting schemes, carrying out carbon audits already, moving to no tillage systems and minimum tillage practices, introducing livestock into rotations to bring in regenerative farming principles across the holding, looking at on-farm renewable systems, so whether that's AD, anaerobic digestion plants, biomass, or on-farm solar, as well as looking at initiatives such as roof rainwater collection. They've also been working with neighbouring farmers, be that commissioners' tenants or otherwise, to form cluster groups to look at biodiversity improvement opportunities, and therefore undertaking studies of wildlife across their holdings to work with organised groups and other environmental bodies to assess further changes that they can help with. Many of our tenants have also been measuring their soil health and organic matter, and again, reviewing ways to improve this. So we're very keen to learn from our farm tenants, who are really the experts at what they do, and they know the land better than anyone else. They're often as well experts in their fields, and we're therefore reviewing further ways that we can collaborate and improve that working relationship that we've already started to build. So this really also looks at including data sharing and finding suitable ways to collect more data, such as through carbon audits or natural capital assessments, having on-site reviews and visits, and looking at energy usage of the farms. So obviously, you can hopefully see that this is the beginning of our journey, and we've got quite a long way to go to understand that position further. But given both the scale of the challenge and the scale of our portfolio, we are actively resourcing and upskilling the team, our existing team, and new members, to enable us to help with the further integration of ESG, so environmental, social and governance, into our day-to-day roles. So if I just perhaps summarise before we head to questions. So hopefully you can see that the commissioners are very much concentrating on integrating sustainability into the investment decisions that we make. This is fundamental to ensure that the strategic direction of the portfolio is able to recognise the challenges that we all have and find ways to respond to both the climate and biodiversity crisis. We've obviously covered some of the ongoing initiatives and stakeholder engagement, which forms a very central part of our role. And importantly, and very importantly, our tenant engagement and collaboration will allow us to seek to continue to manage the land holdings for nature, but as well as food production, and support sustainable farming businesses. We're very supportive of the government's new ELM scheme, as well as encouraging our farmers to adopt regenerative farming practices and make positive changes where they can. And we've seen many of them looking at new ways to improve soil health and work with us to capture data on carbon emissions and biodiversity already. We're very committed to real world change and on the ground action, and as such, the next few years will be crucial for us to ensure that we continue to be part of the challenge, the answer to the challenge, and hopefully lead the way in some of that. So Catherine, I perhaps stop sharing because I suspect we've got some questions.
Thank you both so much. You've covered such a huge amount of information, I think, in those slides, and there's already some great questions there for us to look at. Everyone who's listening, if you have a question, please do pop it in the Q&A, but also you can do thumbs up next to the questions you're most interested in, and those ones will move to the top. I think we will start with the question about tenancy agreements. It says, will the church commissioners make changes to tenancy agreements to allow more tree planting in hedges, margins, agroforestry, etc.?
Brilliant. Shall I take that one, Guy?
Yeah.
Fine. So I think the short answer is yes. We've already undertaken a process of reviewing our tenancy agreements, and just for the benefit of others who are joining us, at the moment in terms of rural farms, there's really two types of farm tenancy. There's a more historic Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, which is a precedent and a piece of legislation that you can no longer grant new tenancies, just successions. So there's obviously slightly limited ability for us to make changes to the tenancy agreements there. But the more modern farm business tenancies, we have been reviewing and making sure that they are aligned with obviously the Agriculture Act, the Environment Bill, and also looking at how we can use those tenancies and new tenancy agreements to form a more collaborative relationship with the tenants. So an example of that might be adding some special conditions in that set out that from the outset, the commissioners and the tenant are going to agree to work collaboratively, have meetings. We have to be quite careful in how prescriptive we are in what specifically those collaborative actions are going to be, to avoid tenants not being able to therefore claim funding through environmental schemes. But we are making sure that the tenancy agreements capture the essence of what we're trying to achieve. We've been looking at how that therefore allows tenants to enter new environmental schemes, whether that's countryside stewardship or the new ELM scheme, so sustainable farming incentive, but also looking at, how often they cut their hedges, for example. So I think that was a very long answer to a short yes. We are, and we will continue to do that as things evolve and change. Absolutely.
Presumably it takes quite a few years to gradually make changes to all of the tenancy agreements, because they must only each one will only come up every decade, or how often do they come up for you?
The tenancy term lengths all vary, and so it's hard. We don't have it's not a regular cycle, but yes, you're right that in terms of the new lettings and putting new tenancy agreements in place, there are only limited opportunities to do that. So, and I'm sure there'll be a question in a minute about collaboration and what we're doing, but that is just one way that we can be very proactive about looking at who our new tenant pool is going to be. And I guess tenancy agreements is only one part of that, but as Guy outlined, the new lettings that we are undertaking are being very considered, and we're really making a point to the tenants we're hoping to attract, new tenants we're hoping to attract. They don't need to be the end product, they don't need to be polished, they don't have to be doing it all, but they need to be willing to look at it and work with us and find ways to make improvements to the holdings that we have. They could be small or very big.
So the next question is about the carbon and natural capital baselining. It's been asked by one of our diocesan environment officers, saying, would it be possible for you to share the process you undertook to do your carbon and natural capital baselining? I'm aware that every diocese will need to do something similar for their land. If you're able to share learning on this, it would be very helpful. So if there are dioceses listening whose ears are pricking up, how would they best engage with that and learn from your experience?
Yeah, I can kick off. So I think the initial process is basically to ensure that each diocesan body understands and has a sort of good mapping data of what they own, and sort of ensuring that all the assets are sort of appropriately understood and mapped, as I say. We then did a carbon audit, which we used a company called Freekill, but there's other companies out there, and that was based on publicly available data. So it takes a sort of average of what an average dairy farm, the production, the amount of carbon which they would have outputted, and an average arable. And we fed into that through our own information. So we knew the number of acres which was down to arable, the number of acres which was permanent pasture, etc., and fed into them. And they provided an output. It needs work required on it, because it's obviously just the average, so it's not specific for each farm. And I expect as the sort of carbon question develops, there's already on-farm tools which provide that data. But given the size of our portfolio, it wasn't felt that at this stage it was appropriate. But as I say, as this develops, I expect that will be something that will form the basis of any further in looking at the carbon output. From a natural capital point of view, we did a snapshot of what our natural capital assets were as of 2019. We used Cumulus consultants, and they used further consultants called ACOM. And this basically, again, you had to provide the mapping data, but through publicly available data, it provided a sort of how much woody features were there, how much hedgerows how much land was down to hedgerows, how much land was down to fresh water, triple SIs, and other such information. And I would say probably they would be the sort of the two easy process to go through. But my biggest piece of advice would basically be ensuring that you have all the data you possibly can get from either agents or from your tenants, and ensure that mapping is up to date before going through the process and then taking it from there.
And if there's anyone listening going, what on earth does natural capital mean?
It's essentially the environment which you are surrounded. So it includes air, water, and land, and it's a sort of a snapshot of that. It's developing, and there will be further definitions coming through, but it is forming part of the basis of ELMs and other elements like that.
Thank you. The next question is from Reverend Canon Mark Horwath. You made mention of Church Commissioners' forestry woodland holdings, but there weren't any stats or locations. Is there any more information that you can give about the forestry holdings?
Guy, do you want me to do that one?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Well, I think it's probably important to say that the commissioners do have woodland. So within the rural portfolio, which is the remit of myself and Guy, we have woodland, which is either in blocks, or, as I'm sure lots of people here will be aware, there's sort of amenity and smaller woodland parcels within farms, and sometimes included within farm tenancies. Our portfolio, as I mentioned, is exclusively within England, but the commissioners, the Church Commissioners, do also have forestry within the UK, so a significant amount in Scotland and Wales, but also globally. So with, again, timberland located in America and also Australia, and we're constantly looking at opportunities for further woodland creation. So I mentioned some of that, and our colleagues who specifically and entirely manage the timberland, so forestry portfolios, are that falls within their remit. Don't know if that answers
the
enough,
forestry assets are managed by a different team from the rural assets.
They are, but obviously, you know, when we look at it, we work very closely together. But also looking at the commissioners' assets as a whole, it would be fair to say that most of the woodland in the UK is in Scotland and Wales, rather than in England, where, as I mentioned, a lot of our land holdings are very productive farmlands, so growing crops, livestock.
Next question says, do you have a rough idea of the percentage of Church Commissioner tenant farmers currently actively engaging with environmental protection schemes or biodiversity projects?
This didn't form part of the remit of the natural capital assessment. However, we are developing a sort of a plan for each farm where we will have details of that, and that is done through tenant engagement and through conversations with our land agents. I would expect it's going to be a high proportion are part of some form of either mid-tier schemes or going forward sustainable farming incentive, but we don't have it available at the moment.
Presumably because government funding is increasingly over time becoming linked to it, farmers are, if they weren't already actively engaging, they're waking up to it now, I assume.
Yes,
exactly.
Definitely. I was just going to add, Catherine, that on top of what Guy has said, from our experience in visiting and meeting with lots of our farm tenants, it's not just sort of collaborative projects or working with others on biodiversity. A lot of them are already doing their own on-farm projects. So if I were to guess a percentage, it would be very high, probably around 80%, that are doing their own thing. And obviously you have to look at it largely on a case-by-case basis. So what does the soil support? What type of farming is it? But all of them, in one form or another, are largely already engaged in doing their own projects or working with others, be that other farmers and landowners or environmental groups.
Brilliant. So a question from Stephen Herbert says, it's very linked really. I think that the theme of tenant engagement has come up so many times in what you said and in the questions. How do you encourage all of your farm tenants to participate in biodiversity, carbon mitigation or enhanced soil management initiatives so that together you can make swift progress towards net zero goals? I.e., how do you nudge those who choose not to collaborate with their landlord?
Brilliant. So I can pick up with one method we've done. So we held an ESG day for our advisors last year, and where we basically outlined what we're aiming and how much progress we want to do. As Ciara mentioned, most of the day-to-day management is done through our agents, and through that they sort of engage with tenants and taking them forward on this. And there's a sort of, and also through positive encouragement with new farm business tenancies. There's sort of two ways which we have sort of engaged with tenants and taking them forward. and encouraging the sort of applying for the biodiversity schemes, etc.
Thank you. The next question is about peatlands and wetlands. Do the Church Commissioners know what percentage of their land is peatlands and wetlands? And can you tell us anything more about what is being done to restore and protect peatlands across the whole of the rural portfolio?
So I have to say, I'll be honest, I don't have the percentage or the stats off the top of my head. Obviously, as Guy said, we've done a natural capital audit, which was a snapshot. So we have the ability to look at across the portfolio what part of the holdings would be considered wetland. I think when we maybe won't spend too much time on this, but obviously within the term peatland, there is some difference between what is peatland and what is categorised as peaty soils. So we do have certainly land holdings with peaty soils and smaller areas of peatland. We are looking at how we can make improvements to this. Obviously, focusing on wetland, I outlined the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust initiative that we're working on, and that's a very big project for us that we're being very proactive about. In terms of peatland, it's slightly more regional because of the location of where peatland or peaty soils are located. So we're looking at established groups. So, for example, we've got the Fenland peat group. So our farm tenants are engaged with that, and we're looking at how we can support them, meet with them, and understand more. So there is a collaboration and a sort of bottom-up leadership of looking at the peatland opportunities. We're also aware that there is peatland mapping being undertaken by the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and again, we're looking at how we can support that, because I think mapping peatland is obviously fundamental to looking at the improvements that can therefore come from it. So we're looking at how we can support them with their mapping work as well.
The next question is, I work for the Cheshire Wildlife Trust and have a nature recovery project in the county which covers Church Commission land. What is your approach to partnership, and would you be interested in working together on this project? So on the specific, maybe the thing is for Martin to put his email address in the chat, and then you can pick that up. But if you kind of can answer generically about how you approach working in partnership on schemes like that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's very much encouraged, and especially it's done on a case-by-case basis, but we have worked in partnership with other wildlife trusts, and we have a good relationship with wildlife trusts, both on a national basis and some of the local ones. So, Martin, I'm happy to share my email on the chat, and would welcome a sort of email and a bit more, but it's on a case-by-case, so it'd be interesting to hear that example.
And Catherine, just before you move on, more generally on working with partnerships, as Guy said, we obviously have to assess all of them, because there's a huge number of people that are doing brilliant things that we'd love to be involved in. So we have to look at where we can make meaningful change and what's going to help our tenants and our sort of holdings the most. But I think the general answer is, and hopefully it came across when we shared some logos of all the people we're speaking with, but we are having lots of conversations. So we will always be interested to have a conversation to find out more.
Thank you. The next question is about land agents. Land agents are key to the relationship with tenants. Can you provide any confidential advice to dioceses on which agents have most adopted this environmental outlook? I'm guessing there's probably a relatively small amount of things that you can say on a webinar that's being recorded, but if there is anything you can say here, that would be great, or if potentially Nigel can follow up with you afterwards.
Yeah, Nigel, again, more than happy for you to follow up with us directly on that question. I would say generically, all of the land agents are looking at this, and they are resourcing to accommodate the environmental challenge and outlook. So a lot of them are recruiting very specific roles, so natural capital advisors, and making sure that their land agents are informed and understand the challenges. I think there's probably a bit further to go, but I'm sure all of them are addressing that, and there's a desperate hunt to find people to fill those roles at the moment. And the other thing that we're also doing is working with Mark Betson and Joe Chamberlain to look at the role of the land agent. So I'm hoping that in time the commissioners and myself and Guy can help the diocesan officers and environmental officers and those who are asset managers to understand how they can really use their land agents to their advantage.
Thank you. Lucy's question is trying to catch something that you had said earlier about knowing that the there's a high percentage of tenants that are already doing things, and she just asked for you to repeat what evidence you have that that tenants are engaging. And I think that's through those on-farm meetings that you've been having, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And there's further tenant profiling which is taking place, and we have been doing, Ciara and myself visiting as asset managers, but also our agents have been feed into it, and there is a sort of a good indication that pretty much, as Ciara mentioned, sort of over 80% probably are in it, but we haven't got a sort of an official figure. But yeah, so that's how we have been conducting that.
Lovely. And then there's a question from Emma about rewilding. What is your strategy regarding rewilding? It wasn't mentioned during your presentation. Wildcard are currently meeting with the Crown Estate to discuss rewilding as a vital component in any large landowner biodiversity strategy. Will you also meet with Wildcard regarding their rewilding campaign on Church Commissioners' land?
Great, thanks for the question, Emma. We are aware of Wildcard. To my knowledge, myself and Guy haven't had an approach or a request to meet, so we'd probably welcome that you contact us directly. Obviously, rewilding means lots of different things to different people, so I think it's quite hard for me to answer specifically on the Commissioner's portfolio, but it's obviously, as I've said from the beginning, a lot of our direct control is with our farming tenants who make the day-to-day decisions of what they do. So if they choose to be a dairy farm, if they choose to convert to organic, if they choose to leave field margins, etc., that is ultimately their decision, and we have some limited ability to control and change that. Obviously, as I've outlined, we're working really closely to collaborate and find ways to create positive change. So it's something that we're looking at certainly, and I think where there's opportunity for a zero intervention and leaving areas for nature, then I think, as all other large landowners are doing, we're very much considering that.
Thank you. There's a question about environmental criteria. Do environmental criteria factor into Church Commissioner decisions about who can buy Church Commissioner land?
Do you want me to take that one, Guy?
Yeah, or yeah, do you want to kick off?
So in terms of who can buy the Commissioner's land, as I set out on the first slide, but it is quite a complex piece of legislation. We are governed by our fiduciary duty within the Charities Act. So in terms of selling land, there is a obligation for us to understand how we can achieve best value. That said, we also have ethical investment policies, and we certainly are very keen to understand who we're transacting with. So at the moment, there is no strict environmental criteria, but it's very much taken into account with the negotiations or the transactions that are undertaken within the frame of our fiduciary duty and best value. Guy, sorry, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
No, I think that covers it. Just that there, obviously the ethical assessment of any purchaser would be considered. So that's always sort of at the forefront of any transaction.
A question from Jemima about energy generation. You mentioned, I think, along the way that you've got both some solar farms, but also some buildings on farms which have now got solar panels on the roofs. Jemima is saying, do you have a strategy for energy generation on your holdings, wind, solar, hydro, and is this a way of being commercially profitable but whilst doing something that's helping us towards net zero?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So if I split it basically into two sections, so if you have on-farm energy, which would be a tenant-led energy scheme, which might include solar panels on a farm shed or a very small sort of wind turbine scheme or something like that, then that's certainly something that we encourage, but that's again done on a case-by-case basis, but the agents are fully aware that that's an encouragement, and obviously it makes the farming practice more achieving sort of lower energy inputs, etc. We have also conducted a renewable review of the whole portfolio, and we are approaching developers to go down this process of both solar and wind and battery storage. This is fairly early stages, and due to sort of grid capacity constraints, it's often sort of takes a long time to really implement, but we are sort of going down this process, and that's certainly something that we do consider.
And am I right that you can have solar farms where the ground underneath can still be grazed, or probably not cropped, but grazed? Yeah,
absolutely. You can have both grazed and also wild flower meadows underneath the solar farms. So that's, and that's becoming increasingly important. I mean, there is solar as an industry is developing far and wide, and there is others where you have floating solar, and so it's all being developed essentially.
We're also looking, Catherine, at other opportunities that aren't the traditional solar, so solar that might be therefore used to generate green hydrogen to fuel HGVs, or looking at compressed natural gas and electric forecourts. So I think the point I'm making is we're not just looking at the traditional renewables, so solar or wind turbines. We're looking at those developments that are coming, coming forward, and looking at how we can support those and incorporate those into the review that we've undertaken and the wider portfolio.
And do you have, if a scheme would take longer to pay back than the current tenant has years on their tenancy, do you have an ability to invest in things directly, or from the Church Commissioner's point of view, or is it down to the individual farmer to raise the money to do a scheme like that?
You can do write down periods for the individual farmer where they'll be compensated for any of the remaining time. So if you had a solar scheme where they put it on and they had a sort of 10 years or 20 years and they had 15-year tenancy, then for the last 5 years you would have a compensatory payment for the individual.
That makes sense. Right, the next question is from Emma. Given biblical teaching on stewardship and the connection between climate change and human suffering, why is the church commitment for net zero lower than that of the National Farmers Union, which is 2040, especially since 2050 is too late to avoid failed harvests and extreme weather events? So I guess that's the question about why is it a 2050 target for church commissioners, although that's across all of the different asset types, isn't it? When the NFU is 2040.
So it's because we're part of the wider fund, and that's sort of falls into the Asset Alliance, and so that's where it sort of stemmed from, with the engagement with farm tenants, and they are fully aware of the NFU's 2040 target, and we are fully encouraging of the taking of tenants going down the net zero route. So if it's achievable 10 years prior to the rest of the fund, then that's obviously beneficial.
Yeah, and just not with the rural portfolio, but other areas of the fund. And as I mentioned, only 25% of the fund is in property, so there is a large amount that is not in real assets and built property. But there are other interim targets, such as a reduction of 25% of carbon intensity by 2025 for some of our assets as well. So there are interim targets, and obviously we're reviewing that all the time.
Sally is saying it would be good to share some of this information with church members. Do you have sort of a bite-sized version of any of the things that you've said that can be used, for example, for a magazine article? I guess if someone was looking for a friendly explanation of quite a technical subject, where would they be best to look?
We don't have anything at the moment, but I'm sure it's something that we could create between myself and Guy that, as you say, is sort of a bite-sized chunk of what we're doing. So that's something we can look at. And again, Sally, if that's a specific point, I've just put my email and Guy's email in the chat, so hopefully you can see that and contact us about that one.
Thank you. Are there any plans to trickle down the partnerships and relationships you're building at a national level? For example, local wildlife trusts working with local churches. So where you're building really good national relationships with organisations that have got local branches, how do we join that up?
So with the Wildlife Trust, we have sort of a quarterly meeting on a national basis, but it's on a local basis. It's more done on a case-by-case basis, just given the local relationship, and that's often done through our agents and us stepping in when required. I think the Wildlife Trust, they've trickled the information down, and we've said that we are open for conversations across the portfolio, so hopefully that will come through. Involving local churches, Wildlife Trust and ourselves is certainly something we can look at, and we can sort of take forward if there is specific opportunities that Jemima has in mind, and then we can sort of move those forward if that's an opportunity.
And then actually kind of the next question is fairly similar to the one about the magazine article. Just what are you doing to publicise the great work that you're doing, getting on Farming Today, articles in the Church Times? What's the plan for spreading the word about all the things that you're doing?
So I guess I'm pleased that, Jemima, you're referring to it as great work. So thank you. That's very reassuring. But also, we're very aware that all of the good work that not just ourselves, but our farm tenants are doing has never really been largely promoted. We've not been very good about shouting about the good news stories. So we've done a few things. We've got a communications agency on board to help us where we can. I would recommend, if you don't already, but follow the Church Commissioners on LinkedIn, because Guy and I are trying to be slightly more active in putting out some of the great stories and the work that we're doing. We can't probably talk too much about it, but there are some planned projects, such as looking at interviewing some of our very progressive and environmentally focused farm tenants, so that we can really showcase some of that good work. And certainly we can consider how we can work closer with the Church Times. I think that's a very good suggestion and thought we can take away.
Lovely. And then the last question, I think this timing is just going to about land of the last question, and it's 5 to 1. Do you do any work with the local parishes which are within where you have landholdings?
Yes, because we have such a significant portfolio, it's probably not a consistent, and it is again a case-by-case basis, depending on where our landholdings are situated, or perhaps how involved the local parish or the parochial church council or the church warden, whoever it may be, sometimes parish councils as well, how involved they want to be. So we do have very active dialogue with lots of them, many of which are tenants. So they might be, for example, parish councils who have tenancies over community areas or orchards, for example. So we do have quite a lot of engagement, but I would say it's case by case, just depending on the location. Again, we're very open to having conversations. So if there are any parishes who'd like to get involved or have any ideas, then we're always here to listen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We've come to the end of the questions and we're just coming up at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much. I think you really shared light for people into an area of work that they just wouldn't have been aware of, about all the efforts that are going on within the Church Commissioners rural team to manage land for climate and nature. So thank you so much for being open to coming along today and telling us all about it. Thank you to everyone who's come along to listen today. I hope that you found it useful, and please do come along to the remaining webinars this week. I've just put the link in the chat through to the where you can find all the information about the remaining webinars. This afternoon I'll send everybody the slides that you've seen today and all those links from the chat, and you'll be able to find the recording on our website in a couple of days' time. Thank you all for coming, and I'll bring us to a close.
Brilliant.
Thank
you everybody.